Okay, in this video I'm going to try and give you some helpful tips in using the Samson tweak bait. Now we've got 3 tweak baits on the range now. The original tweak bait that used to come in just white, it's called now the medium sink tweak bait. But we've added to the range and we've now got a slow sink version and a fast sink version, which are ideal basically for different situations. All these tweak baits are subsurface and basically work the same way using the rod tip, except for the retrieval speed is going to be a little bit different depending on what tweak bait you're using. With regards to the rod you're using, just as a general rule, I would say rods with a stiffer tip are going to work a lot better. It's a lot easier to work the lures with a stiffer rod tip. I find soft rod tips really can deaden the feel and make it hard work, and you've kind of got to use exaggerated actions to get a nice action from that lure. Now basically the difference between these 3 lures is not only the sink speed but also the retrieval speed. So the medium sink, which is the original lure, was designed basically with swell in mind, fishing in rougher conditions. So you've got something that holds solid in the water, can be worked in rougher conditions, say off ledges or through current and waves. So it wasn't, pushed around like a more floaty lure and just overpowered by the waves and the swell. You needed something that could handle a little bit of swell, a bit of current, and still work well in those conditions. Now the slow sink tweak was designed for basically a slower retrieve. It's got a great action, it's much looser in the water, really nice lure, and is ideal over sort of shallow grounds where you might want to bring it through slowly. Could be for snook or for pike, fish that are sort of laying in ambush, sea bass as well. It's a good, often sea bass really will hit a slow lure. On other days they're going to hit a fast lure. So it's really good to have a different range where you can basically use the lure to fit the conditions. So the fast sink tweak is the opposite really. If you're looking for a faster retrieve, or maybe you're out on the ledges, you want to let the lure drop down a little bit, or you want to cast out further to reach some rocks further out, then the fast tweak would be the ideal choice then, or from beaches if you need to cast out a bit further. But it has got a faster retrieve. I fished it in medium speed, medium to fast, in quite shallow conditions, and providing you keep that rod tip up and you keep the lure moving, you wouldn't even get the fast sink tweak snagged. But basically the slow sink is a lot easier to use because of course it's going to drop a lot slower. Okay, so I'm going to give a few ideas on retrievals that you can use with these lures. So first one I'm going to call tap to the rod tip. So basically you're going to get a steady retrieval speed with your retrieval arm, and just going to use little taps, small subtle taps really of the rod tip, providing that rod tip is stiff enough. There's not going to be big exaggerated taps, just little taps and a steady retrieve. Now when you cast that lure out, it's important to turn the bail arm over quickly and get contact as soon as you can with the lure. That way the lure is immediately going to be in contact, it's going to be swimming, and every tap of the rod tip is going to put some action into that lure. If you just let that lure drop down straight away, then it is going to sink. Even the slow sink tweaks sink down, obviously not as fast, but it's really important to get in contact with the lure anyway so that you can work it. It might be that if you're fishing in rough conditions, your lure gets hit by a big wave coming forward and you've got to wind up the slack quickly. So obviously in that situation it's vital that you try and get contact with the lure straight away, no matter what one of the lures you're using, and get that tension in the line again, and then once you feel that tension you can start working it again. Okay, an ideal way to work these lures with the rod tip tapping is to keep the rod tip up, a steady retrieve and little taps. So while that lure's right out there, keep the rod tip up, and if a fish hits it, you're really ready to strike. Plus it's a lot easier on your arm with that rod tip up. If you've got that rod tip down the whole time, your arm and wrist is going to tire a lot quicker. So it's generally better to keep that rod tip up, you're ready to strike, and once that lure gets about, say, 30-20 meters in, then there's a time to drop that rod tip and just work it basically the same, little taps all the way up to your feet. Now if you're bringing that lure in, either one of the lures, and you're approaching over some shallow ground and you're not sure, you don't want to lose the lure, you don't want to risk losing the lure, all you need to do is keep that rod tip up again and increase the speed of the retrieve, and that's going to bring the lure straight to the surface. Of course, if you're using a lure with a beak on it, that's going to dig down and swim more, but with these lures, just bring the rod tip up, increase the speed, and you can bring it over those rocks and just continue like you were for the rest of the way, or until you hit some more, rocky reef. So a second technique is similar to the first technique with taps of the rod tip, but this one's going to include splashes, and it's really as effective when a fish sees some splashing and then a fish looking injured as it's swimming. That's going to send out signals, distress signals. Okay, here's an easy meal, and that fish is going to be on it hopefully. So basically, just going to use those little taps, keep the rod tip high, and just splash that lure to the surface, and then let it continue. Subsurface, it might be just 10 centimeters below, and then splashing again. So this is especially effective over shallow ground, because you can keep an eye on exactly where the lure is without losing it, and you can splash it through to try to attract some of those fish. Obviously you can vary the speed of the lure, so you can use a very similar retrieve but just in a variation of the speed. So just increasing the speed with the taps is going to give it a different look altogether, or just slowing it down, especially pauses with the slow sink. So you can obviously have longer pauses with the slow sink teak than you can with the medium and fast sink. Another good technique to use is kind of sweeps of the rod tip. Again, you can use it on all three lures. Basically just get a steady retrieval speed and then use longer, harder pulls of the rod, depending on the depth the lure's in. They don't have to be too hard, just like a steady long pull, or two pulls together, like pull together, or one long pull. I prefer two taps together quite fast and quite hard, and then slowing, then retrieving and then pull. That really works well, and I think it's especially effective when you're in open water. So if fish see it in open water, it's going to kind of give it that fleeing fish look, that fish is trying to get away, and again that's going to send out those signals, that meal's getting away, and they can see it's in distress, and there's a very good chance they're going to follow and hit it. But for this method, you just got to make sure that you keep the rod tip down rather than up to get that sweeping action. So that's the retrieve I especially would use on the fast sink tweak, but definitely it's a retrieve you can use on all three lures. Okay, as you can see, these lures come with a tail and a belly hook. Now, for most situations you'll use this lure with both hooks. You can take off the belly hook if you're really in shallow conditions and you just wanted to sort of limit the chance for getting it snagged. But in general, two hooks is fine. The only situation I might use one hook is if I'm targeting bigger fish, and like GTs or something like that, and I wanted to take off the belly hook and put an especially strong tail hook on. Okay, another question I often get asked is what size lure should I use and weight? Do you need to use a big lure if you're targeting big fish? Well, it really depends on what you're fishing for. If you're fishing for something like GTs, a bigger lure will help. It's going to create more disturbance, and if they're down deep, they're going to see it. And also you're going to be able to use stronger hooks that's going to, be ideal for if you're hooking to something really big. So if you hook something like a GT with a really small lure, like say a 30 gram, the hook is just not going to be strong enough unless you've upgraded it to one tail hook, which is a good idea in those situations. But for general fishing, I think it's more important to choose your lure size and weight according to the conditions. So If I'm fishing in very calm conditions with these lures, I would say it's a good idea to use smaller versions, lighter versions that are going to be a bit more subtle, that's not only going to attract smaller fish but also the big fish equally. Now, if it was rough conditions or it was windy and I needed to get out more distance, or I needed to, really, that lure to really show out, that would be the time that I'd be using a heavier or bigger lure. Well, I hope some of those tips have helped. Main thing to remember is if one technique isn't working, always try working that lure in a different way. So if you're working the tweak bait slowly and you're using that slow sink tweak and the action's looking good, but you're working it slowly and maybe you get a follow but nothing hits, it's definitely worth changing the action, increasing the speed, adding a few splashes to it, give it some harder pulls, and hopefully you can provoke those fish into attacking when they get those signals of this injured fish trying to get away. So it's well worth mixing up the retrieves and basically see what's working on the day. One day a slow retrieve can be ideal, and another day a faster retrieve can be ideal. Basically, that's fishing, it just depends on the day, but it's important that you try all different ways, see what's working best. If you've got any other questions, please leave a comment and I'll definitely get back to you and do my best to help.